Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping into something huge, really one of the most powerful ideas ever, gravitation.
It really is. We're talking about the theory that basically connects everything, from an apple falling to planets orbiting.
Exactly. And our mission here is to unpack that journey, from how people first saw the stars to Newton's big law, sticking really closely to how it's laid out in this physics chapter.
It's kind of the story of the Great Unification, right? Before this, physics on Earth and physics in the heavens were seen as totally separate things.
This chapter really shows how one single, pretty simple idea applies, well, everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And that core idea, the thing this whole deep dive hinges on, is the law of universal gravitation. So just putting it into words.
Go for it.
The force of gravity between two things depends on, well, two things. It grows with the product of their masses.
Right. Bigger things pull harder.
And it gets weaker as they get farther apart. Specifically, it's inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them.
That square is crucial. $5 is g-frac for 2. That's the heart of it.
But to really get why that simple formula is so amazing, we need to look back a bit.
Yeah, the history sets it up perfectly. You had ancient observers, then Copernicus, who flipped the model to sun-centered.
Which was a huge shift in thinking.
Massive. But the real usable data came from Tycho Brahe.
Brahe. It's kind of wild to think that some of the most elegant physics we have rests on basically 20 years of just staring at the sky and writing down numbers.
Meticulously writing them down. His tables were incredibly detailed, voluminous. He was the ultimate data guy.
No kidding, just pure observation night after night.
And that painstaking work was absolutely vital because it paved the way for Johannes Kepler.
Right, Kepler took all that data.
All those numbers.
And found the patterns. He came up with the first actual mathematical rules for how planets move. But they were empirical, right? Just based on what he saw in the data.
Exactly. He described what was happening, not why, based purely on Brahe's observations.
Okay, so let's unpack those laws. Before we do, though, was it a big shock when he said planets moved in ellipses? Not perfect circles. I mean, circles were the thing for ages.
Oh, it was revolutionary. A huge break from tradition. For literally millennia, the philosophical ideal was perfect circles for heavenly motion. Kepler said, nope, it's ellipses.
So that's his first law.
That's law I, the law of ellipses. Every planet orbits the sun in an ellipse, and the sun isn't at the center, it's at one of the two foci of the ellipse.
An ellipse, just to visualize, is like a stretched circle where the sum of the distances from any point on the curve to those two focus points is always the same.
Precisely. A very specific shape dictated by the data.
Okay, then law 2 deals with speed, right? This one also must have ruffled some feathers, throwing out the idea of constant perfect speed in the heavens.
Definitely. Law 2, the law of areas, states that an imaginary line drawn from the sun to a planet sweeps out equal areas in equal amounts of time.
Equal areas.
Yeah.
Equal time. So what does that mean practically?
It means the planet has to speed up when it gets closer to the sun. The line connecting them is shorter, so it has to move faster along its orbit to cover the same area in, say, 1 day.
And when it's farther away?
It slows down. The line is longer, so it moves slower. The universe isn't moving at a stately, constant pace. It speeds up and slows down based on distance from the sun.
Wow. Okay, and then the third one, law 3, the harmonic law. This connects the different planets.
Yes, this one is incredibly powerful. It links the size of a planet's orbit to how long its year is, its period.
How does it link them?
Mathematically, the square of the period, tolers, is proportional to the cube of the semi-major axis, which is basically the average size of the orbit. We write it to rate it 237. It's a bigger orbit, much longer year, in a very precise mathematical way.
Exactly. The size of the orbit dictates the length of the year. These 3 laws derived from data were the perfect setup for Newton.
Right, because Kepler described how planets move, but Newton was the one who asked the big question. Why? Precisely. And Newton couldn't have answered that without building on Galileo's work on motion, on dynamics.
Ah, yes, inertia. That was Galileo's big contribution, wasn't it?
Absolutely crucial. Before Galileo, people generally thought you needed a force just to keep something moving, like invisible angels pushing the planets.
Right. Constant effort needed.
Galileo turned that on its head. He established a principle of inertia. An object will just keep doing what it's doing, moving straight at a constant speed, or staying still unless a force acts on it.
So you only need force to change the motion, to accelerate it.
Exactly. Force causes acceleration, a change in speed or direction, not motion itself.
So Newton puts this together. Planets aren't moving in straight lines. They're constantly turning, curving around the sun. That means they are accelerating.
Even if their speed was constant, which Kepler showed it wasn't, the change in direction alone means there's acceleration, so there must be a force.
And the big question was, what's the force? What's pulling them sideways, keeping them from just flying off into space?
And this is where Newton makes the leap, the incredible generalization. He proposed that the very same force that makes an apple fall down to Earth
The classic story.
is the exact same force that holds the moon in its orbit around the Earth and the planets around the sun. It's universal gravity.
It sounds simple now, but that connection was revolutionary. And he didn't just say it, he actually calculated it out, right?
Yeah.
To prove it.
He did. He compared the acceleration of that falling apple near the Earth's surface, it falls about 16 feet in the first second, to the acceleration of the moon.
How did he do that comparison? The moon's so far away.
He used the distance and the inverse square idea. The moon is about 60 times farther from the Earth's center than the apple is.
Okay, 60 times farther.
So if gravity follows an inverse square law, the force pulling on the moon should be weaker by a factor of 60 squared.
60 squared. Let's see, 3,600.
Exactly. The force should be 3600 as strong out there. So Newton calculated how much the moon falls away from a straight line path in 1 second due to Earth's gravity.
Did it match?
Perfectly. The moon falls, or accelerates towards Earth, at exactly 13/600th the rate of the apple. The inverse square law predicted the moon's motion based on gravity felt on Earth. It was stunning confirmation.
Wow. That really ties it all together. And this universal idea also explains other things, like tides.
Yes, the tides are a direct consequence. It was known the moon was involved, but Newton's law explained why there are typically 2 high tides per day.
Right, I get the bulge of water on the side facing the moon. The moon's gravity just pulls the water up. But why is there another bulge on the opposite side of the Earth?
That's the clever bit. Tides aren't just about the absolute pull, they're about the difference in pull across the Earth.
Difference, how so?
Okay, think about it. The moon pulls most strongly on the water nearest to it, creating that bulge, but it also pulls on the solid Earth itself.
Right.
And crucially, it pulls on the solid Earth more strongly than it pulls on the water on the far side of the Earth, because that water is even farther away.
Ah, so the Earth itself is pulled away from the water on the far side.
Exactly. The Earth is pulled toward the moon, leaving the far side water behind, creating the second bulge. It's a stretching effect, caused by the differential gravitational force across the Earth's diameter.
That makes sense. It's an imbalance. Okay, so connecting this back to the bigger picture, the real strength of this law is that it explains not just the main motions, but the little variations too.
Absolutely, those wobbles. Because gravity is universal, every object pulls on every other object.
So Kepler's perfect ellipses are just idealized.
They're the first approximation. In reality, Jupiter tugs on Saturn, Saturn tugs back, Earth tugs on Mars. Everything affects everything else, causing tiny deviations or perturbations from those perfect elliptical paths.
And this predictive power had its ultimate test with Uranus, didn't it?
Oh, that's a fantastic story. Astronomers noticed Uranus wasn't quite following the orbit predicted, even accounting for the poles of Jupiter and Saturn.
So did they think the law was wrong?
Some might have wondered, but the prevailing thought was, maybe there's another planet out there, one we haven't seen, whose gravity is causing these irregularities.
Okay.
And 2 mathematicians, Leverrier in France and Adams in England, independently used Newton's law to calculate where this unseen planet must be located to cause the observed wobbles in Uranus's orbit.
They predicted a planet, just from math.
Just from the math and the deviations, they told astronomers, point your telescopes here. And guess what?
They found it.
Almost immediately. They found Neptune, right where the calculations predicted. It was an incredible triumph for the law of gravitation. It predicted existence from anomalies.
That's mind-blowing. And this law isn't just for our solar system, right? It works on much bigger scales.
Oh, yes. We see its effects everywhere. Binary star systems, 2 stars orbiting each other, they follow elliptical paths consistent with the inverse square law.
And even bigger things.
Huge structures like globular star clusters, which are these dense balls of thousands, even millions of stars held together by their mutual gravity, and entire galaxies. Gravity is the engine. It's even the force hypothesized to pull clouds of dust and gas together to form new stars in the first place.
Okay, so the law works everywhere, predicts things, but for it to be really useful for calculations, you need that constant, right? The g in the equation.
Exactly. The constant of proportionality, g, and figuring out its actual value was another monumental task tackled by Henry Cavendish. His experiment is famously described as weighing the Earth.
Weighing the Earth. How on earth, how could you measure the gravitational pull between two objects you can hold when the whole planet is pulling on everything? The force must be tiny.
Unbelievably tiny. That was the challenge. He used an incredibly sensitive device called a torsion balance. Picture this. Two small lead balls on the ends of a horizontal rod, suspended by a very thin wire.
Okay, like a delicate dumbbell hanging from a thread.
Sort of. Then he brought two much larger lead balls close to the small ones on opposite sides.
Ah, so the big balls would attract the small ones.
Minutely, just the tiniest gravitational attraction. But it was enough to cause the rod holding the small balls to twist the suspension wire ever so slightly.
And he could measure that tiny twist.
Very precisely. By measuring the twist angle, he could figure out the minuscule force, F, between the known masses at a known distance.
So he had F, M, and R. The only unknown left in the equation was G.
Exactly. He solved for G. And the value he found is incredibly small, around 6.67 cents times 1011 in standard units. Newton meter squared per kilogram squared.
Wow, that's tiny. No wonder gravity feels weak between everyday objects.
It is. But once Cavendish measured G, scientists could finally use Newton's law, combined with the known acceleration of gravity at the Earth's surface, to calculate the mass of the entire Earth. A huge achievement.
So we have the law, we have the constant. But the chapter then asks, what is gravity, fundamentally? It points out something really strange when you compare it to other forces, like electricity.
It really does highlight how bizarre gravity is in the grand scheme of forces. Electrical forces also follow an inverse square law, which is interesting.
But the strength difference is just astronomical.
It's staggering. The chapter gives the number. The electrical repulsion between two electrons is something like $4.17 times 10 times stronger than their gravitational attraction.
10 to the power of 42. I can't even picture that number.
It's immense. Gravity is unbelievably weak compared to electromagnetism. By far, the weakest fundamental force we know.
And even Newton's incredibly successful law eventually needed an update, right? Because it implied gravity acted instantly across space.
Yes, that was a conceptual problem. How could the sun's gravity affect Earth instantaneously, faster than anything else could travel? Einstein's theory of relativity provided the correction.
So relativity modifies Newton's law.
It does, especially in situations with very strong gravity or objects moving near the speed of light. Einstein showed that gravitational effects can't travel faster than light. Gravity isn't instantaneous, it propagates at the speed of light.
And relativity also predicted that light itself should be affected by gravity.
That was a major consequence. Since energy and mass are equivalent, light, which carries energy, should interact with gravity. This was famously confirmed during a solar eclipse.
Right, by seeing starlight bend as it passed near the sun.
Exactly. It confirmed Einstein's view of gravity not just as a force, but as a curvature of space-time itself.
Relativity also seemed to reinforce something Newton noticed but couldn't explain: the weird coincidence between inertial mass and gravitational mass.
Precisely. Why should an object's resistance to being pushed, inertial mass, be exactly proportional to how strongly it pulls or gets pulled by gravity, gravitational mass? Experiments show they are equivalent to incredible precision.
And relativity explains this.
It incorporates it fundamentally. This equivalence principle is a cornerstone of general relativity, suggesting gravity is deeply connected to inertia, perhaps even a manifestation of it through space-time curvature.
But even with general relativity being so successful, there's still a big piece missing, isn't there? The chapter hints at the edge of known physics.
Absolutely. The elephant in the room. We still don't have a working quantum theory of gravity.
No.
Meaning we can't fully reconcile Einstein's theory of gravity, which works brilliantly for large scales, with quantum mechanics, which governs the very small, the subatomic world. Merging them is perhaps the biggest unsolved problem in fundamental physics today.
So wrapping this up, this deep dive really highlights how Newton's theory of gravitation was this incredible leap, a single universal rule connecting apples and moons.
Confirmed by observations predicting new planets measured in the lab by Cavendish, it unified our understanding of motion.
It's a testament to finding simple rules underlying complex phenomena.
It truly is. And it leaves us, as the source material suggests, with a really profound question to ponder.
Go on.
Well, think about that gravitational constant, G. It's so incredibly tiny. And gravity is so weak compared to, say, electrical forces. Is G just some random number nature picked? Or does its specific, tiny value tell us something fundamental about why the universe is the way it is? Maybe something about its age, its vast scale, the balance that allows structures like stars and galaxies to form at all over billions of years.
Huh. So the weakness of gravity might actually be essential for the universe we see.
It's a deep question the detector raises. Is G just a constant, or is it a clue to the cosmos?
Definitely something for you, the listener, to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.